Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again to continue my monthly Shakespeare series, wherein I'm reading and talking about two of Shakespeare's plays, one comedy, one tragedy. This week we'll be looking at the comedy Twelfth Night and the tragedy Antony and Cleopatra. Not to give too much away, but I enjoyed both of these plays quite a bit more than the two I read last month. Before getting into them, if you could please like and subscribe, it would mean a lot. Thank you. And without further ado, here's Shakespeare's double feature, episode 2. So let's start with Twelfth Night, the comedy. Now, all I really knew about this play going in was that there's a lot of mistaken identity, shenanigans, and apparently a pretty tangled web of love triangles, squares, love whatever shapes. But reading through the play, I was pleasantly surprised by the sheer number of characters and subplots. Everything going on here is a bit chaotic, but it really is chaotic in the most fun way. So, the setup: a brother and a sister, Viola and Sebastian, they wash ashore on a beach of an unfamiliar country, but they're separated, and they both believe that the other is dead. Viola is really our star here, as Sebastian just seemingly exists to confuse everyone later and also maybe provide one happy ending later. So early on especially, we're following Viola. She disguises herself as a young man named Cesario, and she enters into the service of, or he enters into the service of Duke Orsino. Orsino is in love with the Lady Olivia, also in this country. And Orsino sends Viola, remember, pretending to be the young man, Cesario. Orsino sends Cesario to convey, or Cesario, I don't know the pronunciation, sorry, to convey his message of love to Olivia. Olivia winds up falling in love with the Viola in disguise, who we of course know is actually a woman, but no one else does. Meanwhile, Viola is falling in love with the Duke that she's working for, Orsino, who's sent her on this task. So already we have this tangled triangle of cross interests, all made more comical by no one knowing that Viola is actually Viola. Yeah. Meanwhile, Sebastian, the brother, finds himself stranded in this country as well, and he has his friend Antonia with him. It is interesting how much these two seem to care for each other, and there could even be something romantic there, depending on how any given performance chooses to interpret that relationship. But anyway, Sebastian and Antonio, they go into town. Then we cut back to Viola and Orsino and Olivia, that whole love triangle. For a while in the play, there's not too much exciting to talk about with that confused group specifically, but so much of the middle of Twelfth Night is taken up by Olivia's serving staff and friends. Basically, she has an older gentleman working for her, a man named Malvolio. And Malvolio takes himself way too seriously, so the others want to have a little bit of fun with him by writing a letter, like a love letter, and making it look like it's a love letter from the Lady Olivia, whom he serves, and that it's a letter from her to Malvolio, asking him to dress funny and basically embarrass himself in front of her at court and everything. So of course Malvolio finds this letter, does everything that it says, and then Olivia's confusion after he does what he thinks this letter is asking him to do, or what he thinks she's asked him to do, Olivia's confusion and everyone else's cruelty basically leads them all into gaslighting him and making him think he's gone crazy and getting him locked up in jail. So basically they're really just bullying this poor guy and putting him through the ringer for him having been such a pompous ass to them in the past. As fun as all of these shenanigans are, it's actually pretty cruel how far they take this whole charade, and that underlying cruelty here I think adds a bit of depth to this comedy that isn't present in some of Shakespeare's others, and I really enjoyed that. Anyway, when Sebastian shows up, people mistake him for Cesario, or Cesario, of course, because that's his sister dressed as a man, so it makes sense that she'd look like him, like her brother. There's also some silliness with Antonio, Sebastian's friend, getting arrested for having done some piracy in these parts a while ago. Basically, there's just a lot of chaos and silliness in the end, leading up to everyone finding out that the man Cesario was actually the woman Viola the whole time, and this, of course, then leads brother and sister to reunite and happily find that they're both still alive. And Orsino switches up and stops loving Olivia, and now he reciprocates Viola's affections now that he knows she's a she. So Orsino can be happy with Viola instead of chasing after Olivia. Similarly, now that Olivia knows that Viola is a woman, or that Cesario is a woman, well, luckily, a similar looking man comes along, being Viola's brother, so it's kind of like everyone gets a happy ending, gets their match. Everyone gets a happy ending except Malvolio, who was treated so cruelly. Yeah. I really enjoyed this one, and I can only imagine how much fun it would be to put on a production of it. I've actually never seen any version of this other than the loose She's the Man adaptation, which I don't remember enjoying that much. But yes, no. Reading through this play, I found it very enjoyable. Not my favorite comedy. That probably still goes to something more like The Tempest. But there's a lot here in Twelfth Night to enjoy. In particular, as I mentioned, I really like the Malvolio plotline. In a way, it seemed to me like the comedic side plot from a tragedy or history, more so than just another comedic side plot in an already very funny story. That's what it was, really. Hopefully that makes sense. And for how much this play is about characters being confused and misdirected and mistaken, I was worried going in it would get to a point where it was too hard to follow. And similarly, I apologize if my quick recap and brief analysis here is a bit hard to follow, but I was also surprised and happy to find how easy the play itself was to follow along with. I'll add too, I didn't mention the fool character. But I always adore how Shakespeare writes his fools to be the most clever characters in the room, but then at times it's like what they're saying might actually just be nonsense with no deeper symbolic meaning, but then in the middle of a nonsensical tirade, they might say something that really makes you think. Anyway, the Fool was fun and easily my favorite of Malvolio's tormentors. But Malvolio himself is my favorite character in the play overall, especially once we get later on where he's desperately trying to convince everyone that he's not actually crazy. And really quickly, before moving on to the tragedy, I want to call back to a Shakespeare book I read and reviewed a few weeks ago. This is Shakespeare by Emma Smith. In that book, she helped me realize and kind of keep in mind all throughout my reading of this that even though you have a woman dressed as a man and gender mix-ups here, back when the play was originally performed, it would have been entirely men and young men playing even the women characters. So even Olivia, who all the men are lusting after, would have been played by a man, and that male actor would have been doing his best to convincingly show that he was in love with Cesario, a male character played by a female character, played in truth by a male actor, which I think is just a fascinating perspective and layer of complexity that I think we should all always keep in mind when we're reading Shakespeare, what these men had to do to convincingly pull off these female characters. Convincingly pull off and at times comedically pull off as well. And that, I think, kind of leads us nicely into Antony and Cleopatra, a tragedy that I felt was entirely obsessed with masculinity. This tragedy, in many ways, is a sequel to Julius Caesar, one of my favorite of all of Shakespeare's works. And here, in Antony and Cleopatra, we're fully into the reign of the first emperor of Rome, Augustus. A man, Mark Antony, helped win the war against Brutus and Cassius with back at the end of Julius Caesar. Well, now Antony is off partying and whatnot with Cleopatra in Egypt. Meanwhile, former allies and enemies of the emperor plot and scheme to carry on wars across the Mediterranean. Early in the play, Antony's wife, back in Rome, his wife dies, and while he's having fun with Cleopatra in Egypt, and so the emperor and his advisors, they decide to give Antony a new wife to keep him loyal and more easily manageable and more kind of around them, and so they have Antony marry the emperor's sister, Octavia. Well, long story short, Antony returns to Cleopatra, even after marrying Octavia, and then Antony decides to rebel against the emperor because, in his opinion, the emperor has treated certain advisors, members of the triumvirate, dishonorably. Antony and Augustus go to war at sea. Partway through the battle, Cleopatra's ship flees the conflict and Antony follows right after, but he hilariously instantly regrets doing so because of how cowardly and weak this has made him look. And like all the men, kind of like this, with this bro mentality, Antony immediately blames his lack of courage on just how much he loves Cleopatra. He gets mad at her for being so perfect and precious to him that he simply had to follow her instead of staying to fight. So he then decides he has to go back to war with the emperor and get to a point where he can challenge Augustus in single combat. Now, this is kind of interesting with this play being a sequel, because the Mark Antony we know from Julius Caesar and of the early days of the Empire, that Antony was such a fierce fighter, and then Octavian, now Augustus, was just a weak kid. So back then it would have been easy to predict an Antony victory if the two ever had to face each other one-on-one. But this whole play so far has given all of us readers, audience, whoever, this whole story now has totally shaken any of our confidence in Antony's ability to effectively take on anyone mano a mano. And his allies and friends, they even start switching over to help Augustus and to the emperor's side. But Antony isn't even really mad about it. He's very understanding with his bros and with his buddies, and he understands why they think he's a loser. He sends them on their way with kind words and all that. But then, of course, he turns right around and hates Cleopatra. For criticizing him, while simultaneously he's still professing his mad love and really addiction for her. So Cleopatra tells her attendants to tell Antony that she has killed herself out of shame. It's sort of a prank, sort of her playing with his emotions, but I also read it more as like a desperate effort for her to get out of this toxic relationship before that one-on-one duel clash came to whatever end it was going to come to. Antony is devastated to hear she's killed herself, even though, again, remember, she hasn't yet. But he's devastated by this news, and he asks his aide to stab him. His aide can't do it. His aide kills himself instead, and then Antony is like, oh, I see, you were just trying to show me that I should be as brave as Cleopatra, and I should take my own life and not have someone else do it. So he tries to stab himself, but he even messes this up. He botches his own suicide. He's not dead yet, but he's horribly wounded. And he finds out then that Cleopatra is actually still alive. So he goes and talks with her one final time before he perishes. And then we still have one more act to go. Emma Smith in This is Shakespeare that I mentioned earlier, she points out how strange it is that even though Antony gets his name listed first in the title, and even though he gets easily the most lines of any character in the play, he's dead by the end of Act 4, leaving only one title protagonist left in Cleopatra to finish out the show. Smith also points out that this being a later tragedy, she likes the theory or the idea that by this point Shakespeare had one of his actors playing much more serious and deep and like thought-provoking female characters than any of his actors would have done in his earlier plays. And this is how we get characters, interesting characters like, or female characters like Lady Macbeth and Cleopatra. Anyway, Cleopatra, the whole play, has seemed like the true opposite of Augustus, both kind of vying for different sides of Antony's attention. Antony's honor was with the emperor, but his pleasure was with Cleopatra. And now at the end, we're left with both of those characters, emperor and Cleopatra, wondering what to do in the wake of Antony's death. So Augustus wants to pardon Cleopatra and basically say that they're good, but he's going to parade her through the streets to basically say, look at what we won Egypt back to our side. And I think at this point Cleopatra is just fed up with first kind of just being an object for Antony's desire, and now she really wants nothing to do with being an object or a prop for the Emperor, so she kills herself. Yeah, and that's the end of the play. So, what did we learn? Well, not much, other than it seems like the strict and more conservative and masculine lifestyle of the Romans wins out against the more like lusty and feminine style of the Egyptians. But then also, what kind of throws that perspective into, I guess, conflict is that all of the Rome scenes are kind of boring compared to all of the fun stuff that we had in Egypt. The ridiculous fights between our toxic lovers all happen in Egypt, and Egypt is where all the passion of the play really was, and all the excitement. And as much as I enjoyed the dynamic of our main two characters of the play, I really do wish there had been more scenes of the two of them together. I also really enjoyed their two friends, Antony's friend Enobarbus, and then Charmaine. I hope I'm saying that right. That's Charmaine is Cleopatra's friend. I also wish we had maybe more interaction between the two of them, these two friends, maybe some commentary from them about how irrational and crazy their two famous friends are being when they're with each other. One of the biggest downsides of this play that I do need to mention is how much time we spend hopping around with battles, almost battles, political meetings, all across the Mediterranean and across 50 or so quick little scenes, just boom, 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 one after another for all of like acts 3 and 4. It's a lot of moving around, and we don't have much time to get into too deep with any one character's thoughts on the complicated situation unfolding. But then this does make the final scene of the play, with Augustus offering peace to Cleopatra, her seeing through that peace for what it actually is, and her still committing suicide anyway. This being the longest scene and the final scene of the play easily makes this one end on a high note, on its best scene, its most interesting moment. So, while there were some problems, I really did love spending time reading about this toxic celebrity relationship and watching Antony struggle with his idea of honor and masculinity, and watching Cleopatra deal with how the greater world and the Roman Empire perceived her and her place as a pawn in that world. Some wonderful things here. A bit messy and all over the place, with a few too many scenes, but still a worthwhile read, especially for anyone interested in a historical fiction retelling of these events in this kind of era of history. All in all, thanks for watching this episode 2 of my Shakespeare double feature series. I think that should do it. Again, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.